Okay, so it's now a couple of minutes past 1. I can see there are still some people joining, but I think we need to get going as this is part of our very short webinars that we do on Fridays. So welcome everyone. Good to see so many people are interested in legislation and policies and regulations. Please remember that this is not a training session. We won't be able to cover all the details, but just do a short update. So please do use the Q&A function if you would like to ask a question. Normally we do not have the time to cover all the questions, unfortunately, but we're always happy to provide you with responses afterwards. We have automatic captioning on the free webinar, so please use the CC function. And today we have also simultaneously Czech interpretation, kindly provided to us by the Teresia Center of the Masaryk University in Brno, the Czech Republic. So I won't try to read the Czech interpretation, the Czech text here in the slide, but for those of you who need it, there is also a Czech interpretation live going on at the webinar. So let's get going because we have loads of things to cover today. This is supposed to be an update on EU standards and legislation. My name is Susanna Laurin. I'm the Research and Innovation Officer at Funka. I'm also the chair of the Joint Working Group from all the standardization organizations in Europe, ETSI, CEN and CENELEC Group on eAccessibility. So we are responsible for developing and updating the EN301549 standard. And I'm also the representative to the European Union for the UN initiative G3ICT and IAAP. So when we talk about digital accessibility policies in the EU, they are all based on the UN CRPD, of course. And then there is also some kind of umbrella that is called the disability strategy. So that is how the European Union is working with all their disability actions, initiatives, legislation, policy, everything. The flagship initiatives, as they call them, are covered in usually 10-year batches of strategies. And some of the really important things that has happened recently in the previous strategy was the application of 3 directives when it comes to digital accessibility. So first of all, the Procurement Directive, and then the Web Accessibility Directive, and the European Accessibility Act. And please note that this is not a comprehensive list. Many more interesting things has happened and will happen in the future as well. But this is our focus of today's webinar. So when we talk about EU directives, it's important to remember that these directives are, when it comes to accessibility, they are minimum requirements, minimum harmonization directive, which means that they cover all the EU member states, but each member state can also is transposing the directive into the national legislation, which leaves a little bit room for flexibility, and each member state can make sure that the national legislation is not contradictory to other national laws, and that it fits the local, regional, or traditions or conditions and the contexts in the actual member state. And the countries cannot do less than what is written in the directive, but they are free to go beyond the directive. And some member states actually do. When it comes to EU regulations, like the GDPR, for example, that's another kind of legislation that is directly applicable in all member states, and it's the same everywhere. So there is a difference between the different kinds of laws covered in the EU. Another important thing to remember is that the European directives on accessibility, they point to the European standards called the EN, which is European norms, the European standards. So, and this is quite clever because the lawmaking process is very slow and cumbersome everywhere in the world and also in the EU. But as we have the legislation as one piece of paper, and then we have the standards as another one, then the technical specifications can move and evolve and develop with the technical evolution, even though the legislation stays the same. So we don't need to rewrite the law every time there is a development on the technical part. So that is actually very good. Even though the Web Accessibility Directive hasn't been going on for so long, still the standard that provides the minimum requirements of the directive has already been updated a couple of times, and it will keep updating all the time so that the technical requirements are not pointing backwards. So that is important to remember, and also I think something we should be proud of. That part of the legislation works really well. If we just do a short update on what is happening in the Web Accessibility Directive right now, it's under review. So the first period of monitoring has just happened in the member states. And as most of you probably know, the WHO, when it comes to the Web Accessibility Directive, who is covered is public sector bodies and what we call bodies governed by public law, which means organizations, no matter how they are, what type of organizations they are, as long as they are either to a majority funded by or managed, led by local, regional, or national government, they are called bodies governed by public law. So all of these organizations are covered by the Web Accessibility Directive. And then we have the spillover effect, which means that ICT suppliers who want to sell to public sector, they are not in scope of the directive. But of course, they are indirectly affected by the directive, because if they want to sell to public sector, they will need to comply. Otherwise, hopefully, the public sector won't buy from them. So even though the scope of the directive is rather small-ish, still we see a lot of impact also on other parts of the market. When it comes to the what, the Web Accessibility Directive is covering websites, intranets, extranet, documents, and apps. So that is kind of the items that are covered by the legislation. And then when it comes to the how, so the technical specifications, the presumed conformance or the minimum requirements of the directive are listed in the Annex A of the EN301549 version 3.2.1. And again, this version handling can, of course, keep evolving. But the recent one is 3.2.1, and all the requirements for the Web Accessibility Directive are listed in Annex A. And this list in Annex A contains references to many of the WCAG criteria, 2.1 level A, but also other criteria. And this is important. This is sometimes a misunderstanding that the EN kind of equals WCAG. That is not the case. The EN has a much broader scope and covers loads of ICT that are not web-based. And when it comes to the specific minimum requirements of the Web Accessibility Directive, listed in Annex A, it's the chapters that are referring to WCAG, that is true, but it's also parts of clauses 5, 6, 7, and 12. So the list is longer than pure WCAG requirements, but it's not the whole EN, because that would be much more than the web. So this is what the deal is for the presumed conformance or minimum requirements of the Web Accessibility Directive. And if we then look at the next generation of directive, which is the European Accessibility Act, and the Act is a directive. I'm sorry about this, it's not super logical, but formally it is a directive, even if it's called an Act. So this is the legislation that will enter into, that will be enforceable in 2025. And if we look at the who here, who is covered by the European Accessibility Act, it's not really done in the same way. Sometimes we hear that people say, oh, that's for the private sector. And that's kind of true-ish, but it's not the whole truth. So the definition of who is covered in the Accessibility Act is manufacturers, authorized representatives, importers, distributors, and providers of certain products and services. So it's the whole value chain from production to distribution to sales, so to speak, of specific products and services. So it doesn't really matter if it's public or private or NGO or whatever. It's the definition is that it's certain products and services. And if we look at the what, which is of course then the definition of those products and services, they are divided in two parts. So first the products. And the products covered are computers and operating systems, smartphones, self-service terminals, digital TV and streaming services, ebooks and e-readers. So those are the products in scope of the Accessibility Act. When we look at the services, we have the emergency services, we have transportation, and this is important. It's not the actual buses and trains and airplanes. It's the digital services connected to the transportation services. So could be ticket machines or timetables or other information connected to the service. Only the digital parts are covered by the Accessibility Act. And then we have a big chunk of the market, which is e-commerce. And the definition of e-commerce in the Accessibility Act is not only the big companies really focusing on selling things online. It's even if it's a shop or a service that also have physical a physical shop, but that also sells things online, or maybe even an agency that provides many different things in their daily businesses, but also have some kind of online place where you can buy things. That is considered e-commerce. So it's a very, very broad definition of e-commerce. The only thing is that micro enterprises are not covered. So if the company is having a revenue of less than 2 million euros or less than 20 staff, then they are not covered. But otherwise, if you sell something and put it online, then it's deemed to be e-commerce. So this is really a large group of organizations covered here. And the second really important part, I think, or all of them are important, of course, but where we see a lot of activity happening in the market right now is the consumer banking services. And of course, they have also important systems and a lot of technology and security to take care of. So it's important that the banks start working on accessibility. And most of them have already, but really making sure that they are in place to comply with the regulations in 2025. One really nice thing, I think, about the European Accessibility Act is how the aim of the act is described. So accessibility is described here as the way for these products and services to maximize the foreseeable use. I think that's really a beautiful way of putting it. But of course, sorry, if you're a developer or designer, to maximize the foreseeable use is not really detailed enough to know what am I supposed to do and how am I supposed to do it. So there are also more granular requirements. And this is where the Accessibility Act becomes a little bit tricky to read and understand for many users, because the requirements are in different places. So you have the general requirements of the Accessibility Act, speaking about accessibility requirements on a kind of generic level. And then there are specific requirements that are for the product part of the legislation. And then there is another one similar, but slightly different, covering the requirements for services. And then there are also some sector-specific requirements. So when you read the Act, you really need to look at requirements in 3 places. So that's maybe not the best way to do this from a usability perspective, but that is how the Act is written. And it doesn't stop there, because of course, this legislation also needs the presumed conformance covered in EN standards to show the technical specifications of the minimum requirements. So, and unfortunately, the standardization request for the from the European Commission to the standardization bodies is not yet finalized. So it's not public, but it's soon to be, I hope. But what we do know already is that the EN301549, covering products and services, will be required to be updated. So we will keep pointing to the EN301549 and make sure that it's updated to fit with the new requirements of the Accessibility Act. Also in the standardization request, there is a request to update the EN17161, which may not be as known to most of our clients, at least. And that is the 17161 is the standard covering how to use the design for all approach in producing products and services to make sure that you reach a broader audience, so to speak. So that is more of a process-oriented standard, if you will. And the third standard covered by the request is the EN17210, which covers the requirements for the built environment. So 3 big standards that needs to be updated, and everything needs to be happening until 2025. And at a more nerdy level, there is also a request for 2 technical reports to be updated as well, but I think that most of you will not need to take those into account very much. It's just an update for more formal reasons. But still, 3 big EN standards needs to be updated, and that will take time. And we are a little bit short of time because standardization work is usually not a super fast work, and of course all of these organizations who are covered by the Accessibility Act wants to start working now. So we are a little bit in a hurry, all of us. But I would say don't wait for the standardization request to come or wait for the standards to be updated, because it will take years before we are finished with that, all the voting processes and negotiations and all of that. So my strong recommendation would be to start now to make sure that you're prepared for 2025. So, and we always recommend to start with looking at where are you right now. So if you look at the current status of your product or service, you can use the EN301549 because we know that will still be part of the minimum requirements, and it's recently updated. It's already working as the presumed conformance from the Web Accessibility Directive. And if you start with checking towards the EN301549, at least you have that baseline accessibility in place, or that check. And then with the updates that may or may not come during the upcoming years, you will have fewer updates to do yourself. So that would be my strong recommendation. Don't just wait, but start with looking at how your status is when it comes to the EN301549 today. Another recommendation is that now, since you have 3 years before the law is enforceable, then this is a fantastic opportunity to really plan and prioritize. Make sure that the accessibility doesn't become a super big barrier and cumbersome and expensive and stressful, but really you can do it when you already do other development or redesigns or updates of your product or service. You can make sure that you put accessibility into place when that is already happening. So it becomes part of your everyday workflow, so to speak, in business. And it's also extremely important to build accessibility thinking into your internal processes, so that it's not just ticking boxes and making sure that works and that little piece work. All organizations that are successful when it comes to accessibility, they have a good internal process. They know how to post the requirements when they buy things. They know exactly who is in control of what, who is responsible, what's the workflow of making this happen. How do we test? When do we have users involved? What assistive technology do we test with? And so on and so forth. So building that internal process is equally important as ticking the boxes, or maybe even more so. And another strong recommendation built on our experience since many, many years is to try to build your internal competence. If you do need help, we are happy to help. And there are also many other companies out there who are happy to help you. But it won't be sustainable if you're too dependent on external experts. You need to know at least the basics of accessibility and have that competence in your own organization. That's the only way to succeed, I would say. And of course, when needed, ask for help, not only from experts, but maybe even more from end users. Make sure to involve end users and testers and other experts, but really the users are the real experts in accessibility. So make sure to have a good ecosystem around you with users with varying with various forms of user needs and expertise on accessibility, and start moving now. Then you will be fit for fight in 2025 when the law becomes enforceable in the European Union. So that was a really, really fast walkthrough of, of many complex things, but that's how it is in 20 minutes. So we do have a little time for questions. If we have got questions in the Q&A, I will try to look at them. Ooh, we are getting questions in different languages. This is good for my brain. So we do need to, I'm translating as I'm reading, we do need to look at the whole Annex A of the EN standard and not only the WCAG 2.1 to ensure that we are meeting the legal requirements. What is it that in Annex A that isn't covered in WCAG? So maybe we could, maybe I can ask Eva to put the EN standard in the chat, the link to the EN standard in the chat, and just the page of the Annex A, because I think it's a little bit hard to discuss this without having without looking at it. But it's absolutely true that the clauses are from clause 5, 6, 7, and 12, and they are conditional. So it's not that you need to first look at what are the items we are looking at, and are they I need to start that sentence, I think. So the Annex A is looking at conditional and unconditional requirements. So the unconditional ones are the ones that always apply, and the conditional ones are where the requirements start with when ICT is something. So for example, when ICT is a video, then you need to comply with the video requirements. If there is no video in the ICT, then it doesn't apply. So in the Annex A, you need to look at both what requirements are there, and also if they are marked with a U for unconditional or a C for conditional. And the conditional ones, then there's kind of an if or when the ICT is blah, blah, blah. And then you need you see what is in focus. But it's true that the whole Annex A is something you need to look into to be able to respond to if you are meeting the requirements of the web accessibility requirements or not. So the EN, and I guess that is the EN301549, adds many new criteria. Unlike the WCAG success criteria, they are not complemented by an understanding and how to meet. I know that a standard is not a manual, but we need clarification on all of those new clauses. Who will provide this guidance and when? That's a good question that I can't respond to. I don't think that it will be in scope of what the Joint Working Group or the Special Task Force will do. It's not how the EN standards are set up, but I know also not only this question, but also from some of the member states that we have been talking to when doing the WAD review, we know that there's a lack of understanding of some of the EN requirements, and also that it seems for many people easier to follow the WCAG guidelines because there are these understanding documents and how to meet documents and so on. So I think it's a good question, and something that I will certainly discuss in the Joint Working Group and see if we could make something like that happen. Another question is, of course, the translation piece, because the free version of the EN standard is in English, and in some member states there is a problem with the national standardization bodies doing translations, but then you need to buy that translation. So it becomes a little bit strange. And also not all member states are translating the standard. And here is where this grouping of the three standardization organizations makes a complexity, because it's ETSI, CEN, and CENELEC working together with this standard, but the business logic behind the standardization organizations are different. So in some instances, the standards are provided for free, and in some instances, you need to buy them. So that is kind of a tricky piece to solve. But I thank you for the question about how to meet an understandable or understanding documentation. I hope that either the Joint Working Group or some other organization will take that on for the next generation of this. So another question is, are cloud providers also covered by the EU Accessibility Act? I'm not sure what a cloud provider would be, but if a company or organization are providing these specific products and services that are covered, then it shouldn't be, where you are based or something. I don't know if a cloud provider, if I understand really the meaning of this, but it doesn't really matter where you are based or what type of organization you are. But if you are providing, producing or selling or importing or distributing the products and services covered by the Act, then you are in scope. So I hope that answers the question. Otherwise, please get back to me and I'll try to understand this better. So what about education? For instance, private schools, driving schools and such. Well, education is, if it's not, the products and services could be used in schools, of course, and then, or educational systems, and then the products and services are covered, but the schools as such are not in scope of the Accessibility Act. In the Web Accessibility Directive, schools and kindergartens are possible to cover or take out of the scope of the directive, so that differs between different member states, and some schools are covered, some are not, so it's not really equal in all the member states. You would need to look at the national legislation to know if you're referring to the Web Accessibility Directive, if it's in scope or not. And then we have a question: annual turnover or annual balance sheet total not exceeding 2 million euros is, in my opinion, a bit too generic when we regard the GDP differences between EU countries. Any plans to allow per country definitions of micro enterprises? Oh, that is far away from my competence. I am not aware who is in charge of defining what a micro enterprise is, but it certainly is not specific to accessibility. So this is a definition used by the EU, and I don't know who would be able to change that if that is at all possible. But it's not specific for accessibility. It's kind of a generic definition of what a micro enterprise is. What does the legislation say in other countries if you, for example, create a digital product that is used worldwide? Yeah, I am not an expert in worldwide legislation, but generally North America has quite strong accessibility legislation. It differs between the US and Canada, but they have for a long time been kind of ahead of Europe. Also, some of the Asian countries have legislation in this respect. And now the EN standard is actually spreading. So, for example, Australia, Kenya, and I think also Canada is on their way to adopt the EN standard, and also some of the South American countries are adopting the standard. So the kind of more European way of doing accessibility is spreading throughout the world. And also, as the EN301549 is pointing to WCAG 2.1, we are actually kind of nowadays a step ahead of the US when it comes to the requirements, because the US are still pointing to WCAG 2.0. But I don't know enough about the whole world to say, to give an example or say what happens. But as the European Accessibility Act covers the whole way from production to sales, it doesn't really matter. If you want to sell your product or service in the EU, you need to comply with the EU regulations. And then, of course, since that is not harmonized all over the world, if you also want to sell the same product somewhere else, then you would need to comply with other regulations. And that is kind of that shows very clearly, I think, the need for harmonization and what a brilliant tool standards can be when they are worldwide and we have the same regulations everywhere. So the aim and hope is, of course, for internationalization of these requirements, and that all or many markets at least will follow. But right now the EU is actually leading when it comes to the requirements, which is quite interesting, I think. So at what URLs is more in-depth information available on the non-WCAG criteria in Annex A? Yes, so I hope we can have that put in the chat. It's the same question as before, really, the Annex A of the EN. So coming back to that. So I think that is what we can do today. It's also 1:30, so thank you very much for attending, and I hope that you will come back to us next Friday. Unfortunately, I'm not really sure what the topic will be, but I'm sure it will be super interesting. And again, if you have any more questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us, and keep up the good work. Thank you, everyone. And thanks to Lucas and Paulina for the Czech interpretation. I'm sure that was perfect, but I have no clue. But it was really nice having you here, and I hope I haven't been speaking too fast. So thanks a lot, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your Friday.